OSU Small Farms Extension over on Hanley Road, and I'm facilitating this session on land leases that I had a feeling would be incredibly popular because in my job at Extension, I get phone calls frequently from either people that own land and are interested in having someone come and lease it, or the opposite, from a new beginning farmer or someone who's just moved to this area that's interested in finding some land to lease since the price of land is fairly expensive in this area. This morning I just got an email from someone in Reno who wants to relocate to this area and is looking for a land lease. So it's really a hot topic, so I'm really glad that you all are here. So I just want to tell you a little bit about how this is going to work. Our first speaker, Nellie McAdams, is going to talk for about half an hour. Nellie is the iFarm Program Director for Friends of Family Farmers, which is one of the organizations that's helped put on this event. And she's also the policy liaison. And she's been with Friends of Family Farmers for a little bit over a year. And Nellie says it's fine to go ahead and ask questions during the session so we can keep it a little bit of a discussion. From there, we're going to hear two accounts from local local landowners who are currently leasing part or all of their acreage to other farmers. So first we'll hear from Nancy Vaughn of Vaughn Farm and Ranch. Nancy's right here. And she'll come up and speak for about 15 minutes about her experience. And then we have Linda Brown-Shape, who will be arriving shortly, and she is the owner of Yale Creek Ranch out in the Little Applegate Valley. So she'll also speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 minutes of question and answer. So, without further ado, I'll pass it to Nellie.
Thanks, Mom.
I'm going to shut this now.
Hi, everybody. I just wanted to start out, I know we all have our handy buttons on, but if you can raise your hand if you are looking to lease land, if you're a farmer looking to lease. And who has land here that you're willing to lease out to a farmer? Okay, and then who's looking to buy, to purchase land? So a couple people, and who has land to sell? Okay, that helps me narrow it down a little bit.
And just sorry to interrupt you, I'm going to just walk down this aisle and pass the sheets along, so if you can pass them, and then we'll go from there. So everyone will get there are 4 handouts.
Well, I'm just going to give you a little bit more about my background. First of all, I grew up on a farm an hour outside of Portland in Gaston. We have 300 acres. Hazelnuts is 100 of those acres. We have 100 acres that we lease out for clover and grass seed. So I'm going to be using that lease as a bit of an example in the talk. And then we have 100 in timber. And I'm a 3rd generation on that property, 5th generation in the valley. In addition, I do work for Friends of Family Farmers, which Representative Buckley was very generous to give that shout out to during his speech. And what I do is, as iFarm Program Director, is help link farmers to people who have land either to lease or sell, or for creative options like a lease-to-own sort of situation. We like to call it eFarmony because it's sort of like an online dating site for potential farmers. We also have a lot of resources available, and just try and let folks know all the different options that they have for leasing out their property. In addition to that, I am also an attorney, and I graduated in 2007 from Lewis and Clark with a degree in environmental and natural resources law. That said, I sort of need to put it out there that I'm not practicing now. I've never practiced real estate law, and I'm not your attorney. So that's my little disclaimer, but I'm happy to give you any sort of general information that I can, and as Monty said, you're welcome to ask me questions at any point. So my talk is going to be sort of the 10,000-foot view and getting into the general considerations in actually crafting a contract. Nancy and Linda are going to be talking about their own personal sort of situations, and they're going to be a great resource for dealing with a lot of the unexpected things. But I'm going to give you sort of a general overview. So I'm going to start with initial considerations for establishing a land contract, and that can be for any kind of land contract. So that can be for a partnership, that can be for a sale, that can be for a lease. Anytime that you're looking at property and you want to invest your time and money in it, these are some of the considerations that you want to take into account. Then I'm going to be going into 3 requirements for a land contract and 3 considerations that anyone should sort of think about before entering a land contract. Then I'll get into the 6 different types of lease and lease-to-own sort of situations. And then we'll start getting into some terms, the different payment schedules that you can set up, and the different types of terms, or the length of time that your land lease will be around, and the different considerations you're going to want to have for that. The handout, actually, the purchasing or leasing farmland is also a really good one. That's going to have a lot of my talk in it. There's one also, it's another 6-pager, but that's also especially for folks who are looking to purchase land. So that's from a real estate agent. He sort of put together a lot of the websites that you want to look at, like Zillow, RMLS, Craigslist, obviously, and then a lot of the different websites that you're going to want to look to in creating your file. And that's just a complete description of that property that you're looking into. So starting with initial considerations, one thing that I want to put out there is that a lot of folks enter leases with family and friends, and that's wonderful, but you want those relationships to last. And so as you're going about this process, there are no friends. At least in the research piece of it. And you absolutely want to do due diligence in looking into the background of whoever you're about to be partnering with for money for a great deal of time. So you're going to want to, landlords want to ask tenant for a business plan, just to know how serious they are in this proposal. They're also going to want to ask for a credit check, which will tell you probably a lot of things about the personality and the track record of this person, their ability to pay. And they're going to also want to ask for references. So if tenant has ever leased land before, owned land, worked with another farmer, you're going to want to ask for those references and give a really good follow-up asking about the integrity of this person and basically to find out whether you're going to be able to work with them in the future. Tenant has a little bit of a larger burden, and that's because there is so much information out there, and that's because you're looking at the land and at the person who you're renting from. So I would also say that tenant could run a credit check if they wanted to. What's maybe a little bit more valuable is to run a title search. You're going to want to know who exactly holds the deed. Is it the landlord? Is it a trust? If it's a trust, then the decision-making authority is in the power of all the trustees. So landlord might be making representations to you that they might not necessarily be able to follow up on and get all the trust members on board. You're also going to want to look for outstanding mortgages as tenant. And in the title search, you also find out how much is outstanding. If that amount outstanding is concerning to you, you can contact the bank and ask them to sign on to your lease and sort of just saying that in the event of a bankruptcy, that your lease will sort of get priority and that your lease will stand if this property has to transfer outside of the intent of the landlord. And you're going to also, the third thing that you're going to want to look for in the title search is easements. And there are two types of easements that you're going to want to look at especially. One of them is a conservation easement, and if landlord is signed a conservation easement, say with NRCS, you're going to want to find out the exact specifications of that easement. So, is tilling allowed? If so, is it allowed over the entire property? Are animals allowed on this property? Does the conservation easement have any sort of positive actions that someone needs to take on this property? And if so, is that going to be tenant's responsibility or landlord's responsibility? And as will come up as sort of a theme in this talk, the longer the term of the lease, the more those responsibilities generally tend to fall on the tenant. The shorter the term of the lease, and just in order to keep the tenant interested in the property, and because tenant doesn't have necessarily a secure long-term interest in that property over, say, 10 years, tenant might not know if the lease will be canceled at a later time. Landlord usually tends to take on more of those long-term tasks and duties. And then the second type of easement you're going to want to look at is access. So just because there's a road doesn't mean that landlord owns that road or has an easement allowing you to travel over that road. So you're just going to want to make sure that you have the ability to access your agricultural land. The next thing that you're going to want to do is sort of look into zoning and permits. So make sure if it is an urban area that you can farm in that area, that it is zoned for agricultural use. And make sure that if you're going to have a farm stand, that it's zoned for retail use, or that that's covered before you consider this property. If there is already a farm stand on there, make sure that that farm stand has permits. Make sure that any processing building has permits. Make sure, basically, any representation given to you by the landlord, by the buildings on the property, or by what other neighbors are doing doesn't necessarily say what you're going to be allowed to do or what the county is going to sort of tell you you're going to be able to do maybe 2 years down the line when you've already put a lot of investment into the infrastructure. So definitely look into that. And then the third sort of piece of record that tenant's going to want to look into is sort of the history of the property. So there are a couple of resources in the handout from the real estate agent, but a couple that I'm going to point out are historic aerial photos. So that'll tell you what the property looked like in the past. It will tell you if there used to be a pond where you're now about to be farming, It'll tell you if part of the area was forested and maybe what sort of crops were growing there before, so you can maybe anticipate what kind of weed pressure you're going to be having. The other one is Oregon hazard info, and I would look on that for flood maps. Just to give my property as an example, in September we had a lovely sort of 40 acres down in the bottom filled with tall fescue. In October, about 20 of those acres were a duck pond. Not by anyone's intention, but that's just how our property works. It's just clay. And so if you would have come and seen that property in June, you would have never have known. You probably would have been able to guess, but it wouldn't have been obvious just how much land would be absorbed in that water. So definitely take a look at that Oregon hazard info. And then sort of the third thing for tenant to do, and I guess it's sort of a fourth, so after the title search, the zoning, and the historic information, is probably the most important, and it's talk to your neighbors. So talk to the neighbors of the landlord. And you want to do this for two reasons. You want to find out the real condition of the land. You want to find out the weed pressure. You want to find out where batteries have been dumped in the past or cars. You want to find out maybe some of the landlord's quirks and just maybe do a little bit of gossiping on that front. But you also want to find out what neighbor does on their property. And if you are planning to certify for organic, but neighbor really likes to spray Roundup on the edges of their property, then you're going to want to know that. You're also going to want to know what their tillage practices are like if you're growing a crop that's really susceptible to dust damage. So any leafy greens or that kind of thing, you're definitely going to want to know how neighbor uses their property. And I'll point out too that neighbor and personality are two of the things that you really can't control for in these contracts. So you're going to want to make sure from the beginning that you're going to be able to live with your neighbors and that this isn't going to be too serious of an impediment.
Nellie, do you have suggestions like on an interpersonal? Because it sounds like a great thing to be talking to the neighbors, but then in actuality, it sounds like it'd be challenging to just like knock on someone's door and say, you know, can you rat out your neighbor to me?
Yeah, I know.
I'm just curious if you like have experience, if you've heard people talk about any like successful ways of approaching the neighbors.
To be quite honest, the reason I bring this up is because a lot of people haven't talked to their neighbors, and it might be because it is too daunting. I would say probably don't right off out of the gate start asking about the landlord's mental health or anything like that. But maybe sort of easing into it and just like asking, just being very casual about it. And just because you're going to be this person's neighbor too, so you don't want to seem like a narc or anything like that, but you definitely want to form a rapport with them from the very beginning. So that's I think probably the only advice I could give is just being really gentle about it and reading between the lines. So once you've done all this preliminary work, you're going to want to create a baseline for the property. And that is going to be a document that you and landlord, tenant and landlord are both going to sign and date and store with their lease agreement and probably file with the county. You could do that too if you just wanted to keep that information there. If landlord and tenant cannot agree on some of the conditions of this baseline, which I'm going to go into, you can also get a third party that could walk that property with you, and possibly contacting OSU Extension might be a good idea. But just agreeing on a third party who can then sort of make those agreements about the condition of the property at the time of the lease. So in that baseline, you're going to want to determine what buildings and structures are included and the exact condition of those buildings and structures. If a tenant's not given permission to use some of those buildings or portions of them, you definitely want to note that in the lease and in the baseline statement. You're going to want to decide exactly the size of the property that's being leased. Is it the entire property, maybe including forest and non-arable land? Is it just the arable land? If it's the arable land, what is considered arable? And you're probably going to want to include a GPS map that absolutely marks out what land that is that a tenant's going to be paying for and using and have permission to use. You're going to want to determine the quality of the soil. And so you're definitely going to want to know soil type, but probably more important are the things that can change over time and would change possibly by the end of the lease. So that would be that would require taking a soil test from certain portions of your property, and probably doing that regularly, even once a year would be an excellent idea, from the same locations and sending it to the same soil testing company, just so that you have that baseline and tenant can prove care for the soil. Tenant definitely wants to keep good records of these things. You're also going to want to mark any areas of potential erosion and note any weed coverage or potential weed pressure in the area. And then water, and this one I probably could have put in initial considerations too, but I just put it down here because you're going to be putting this in your baseline agreement. But you're going to want to go to the Oregon Water Resources Department and use their mapping tool online and determine exactly how many acre feet you have for exactly what acreage and where. And a lot of times people get water rights and assume it's for the entire property. However, often you only get water rights for a portion of the property. So say landlord has 10 acres. Landlord might only have water rights for 5 of those acres. When that becomes really tricky is when landlord or another tenant is using maybe 5 acres of the land, using water rights on 2 of those acres. So when the new tenant comes in and takes the other 5 acres, they might only have 2 or 3 acres that they can use those water rights on. So you want to find out how many water rights are possible for the property and how many are already being taken, so that you can determine for yourself whether it's going to be worth your while to grow the crops that you want to grow on this property. Probably a good idea too to check to see if it's been put to beneficial use in one out of the past 5 years. And water rights, it's a use it or lose it system in Oregon, as in most Western states. But that is a sort of a reporting system. So unless your neighbors or anyone else sort of down the line in priority complains that you're not using it, so they should be able to have these water rights, it's probably fine, and you'll probably be able to keep those rights. They won't be removed. But you definitely want to see if there's going to be any threat of losing your water rights before you even get onto the land. So those are some of the initial considerations. That's your baseline agreement that you're going to create, sign, file, and keep with the lease. Next, I'm going to go into the 3 requirements for creating a land contract. So the first one is to get it in writing and signed. And all of these have caveats. You can get around all of these 3 requirements, but I highly, highly recommend them if you have the time and if you want to avoid future pain. So getting it in writing and signed, there's something called the statute of frauds in Oregon and all states, and that requires any land contract that's going to be for over a year to be in writing and signed by the party against whom it's enforced. So if tenant's suing landlord on the contract, landlord has to have signed it. If landlord's suing tenant on the terms of the contract, tenant has to have signed it. It's easy to just get both of them to sign and get it dated. A land contract that is an oral contract is enforceable in a court up to 1 calendar year. And if tenant has some crops in the ground already, say garlic, and they want to come back and harvest that at the end of the 12 months when that contract began, they're entitled to do that. But the contract is no longer legally enforceable, the oral contract, after 1 year. I want to point out too, getting it signed in writing in the first instance is really important. What's also important is to get any modifications signed in writing. So if a conservation easement is added and responsibilities are divvied out, you definitely want to write that into the lease and record it again with the county and keep that in your files, that new one. Sign those modifications and date them. And I want to say too, it doesn't have to be really elaborate boilerplate. It can be written on a napkin and crayon if you want to, just so long as it's sort of indelible writing material on paper, that can be enforceable on the parties that sign it. So the second requirement that's not an absolute requirement but strongly suggested is to have an attorney look over it. So you can use form leases, you can draft your own lease, you can create your own provisions, but there are so many different considerations that you might not have in mind that might come up at the end of 10 years. Say, how is it going to be renewed? A lot of considerations that a lawyer can really weigh in on, and if you just have them sort of come in at the end and to review the document, that at least gives you a little bit of security. I also want to urge you that using boilerplate, you don't have to accept everything that's on that boilerplate. Just because a lease document is given to you doesn't mean that you can't question any individual provision, so long as it's not required by state law. Cross that out and have both parties sign on that. So I just know, like in my perspective, like whenever I see online a document come up with a big contract and the little button that says agree, I just press that immediately, but I just want to urge you not to do that and to ask as many questions as you possibly can to understand fully the terms of your lease. The third requirement is to file the lease document, or at least a memorandum of the lease, with the county clerk. And this helps put any future lessees on notice, just in case landlord decides to lease out a portion of that, or forgets that a portion of your property is included in your lease. It also puts any other banks on notice, or anyone else who's purchasing the property in the future on notice, that you have that you have this lease and that your right to lease this land supersedes their right, or it exists after they've purchased the property. You want to get that in writing, but your lease will exist after it's after someone else buys the property. And I would say that this is especially important if you're going to be having right of first refusal or option of purchase, which I'm going to be going into in just a second. So those are the 3 requirements: writing and sign, have an attorney look over it, get it recorded with the county. Some 3 major considerations to have in choosing the form of your lease and the type of terms that you want to have are management, farming philosophy, and estate planning. So with management style, landlords are going to have to decide how much time and effort they want to put into managing this property. A couple considerations with that. The more effort that landlord puts in personally to this property, the more likely that landlord's going to be taxed as self-employed for income tax purposes. And this is especially the case with like commodity leases that are sharecropper variable cost leases, which I'm going to go into too. But the more management that landlord shares and the more risk that landlord takes on, the more likely that landlord's going to be taxed as self-employed. And then the other thing which I sort of touched on is especially in regards to improvements. The longer the term of the lease, the more that landlord is going to be expected to put into those improvements. And I'll just give you a really brief example from our farm. So I mentioned that it floods a lot, and our tenant had come up to us and asked us to put in new tile line because our old tile line put in about 60 years before it was starting to crumble. So we did that, and we paid the full price. We paid $15,000 for that new tile line. The reason that we paid for all of it was because our tenant's lease was just a 3-year lease. If that lease had been a 20-year lease, then they would have been benefiting, the sole beneficiaries of that new tile line, for at least for a third of the tile line's life. Say if the tile line is going to last 60 years and they were going to be having the property for another 20. So we would have expected them to chip in and maybe even just sort of coordinate that improvement. But since tenant didn't have a lot of security knowing that they would have this lease for the next 20 years, since it was just a 3-year lease, we ended up paying for that. So that's just an example of how tenants' responsibilities tend to increase with as the length of the lease decreases. Farming philosophy, I think we can all sort of understand how this is going to affect any lease. If you want the property to be organic, then you're definitely going to want to specify that. Less than certified organic, you're definitely going to want to specify what pesticides you're comfortable with being used. What are you comfortable with having being used around a riparian area? What kind of fallowing, what kind of cover cropping system do you expect? And it can be sort of nitpicky maybe on landlord's part, but if landlord has a short-term lease and really wants to build the soil and make sure that this is going to be not sort of run into the ground, then the landlord can make those specifications and those exact requirements in the lease. And then the last one is estate planning, and I think we're going to have a great presentation later on this afternoon on a lot of estate planning considerations, but that's just something for a farmer to consider right off the bat is, do you want a family member to have this property? Short of that, do you want to know the farmer who's going to be farming this property after you're gone, and do you want to sort of mentor them along the way? And so that's something that you're definitely going to want to consider in estate planning, and as we get into the types of leases. So for the types of leases, I have sort of 6 types down here. There are probably as many types of leases as folks can imagine, and a lot of those would probably fall under the creative or barter category that I have. But the standard lease is what I'm going to be talking about mostly as far as the terms when we get to that. Some of the special provisions you can add to a standard lease are right of first refusal. And so these are sort of the lease-to-own style provisions. There are a variety of them just depending on your interests and everybody's risk acceptance level. But right of first refusal puts the decision in landlord's hands to say when they want to transfer that property to someone else. And the right of first refusal is purchased by tenant or anyone else, it doesn't necessarily have to be tenant. Anyone can purchase a right of first refusal so that when the owner of that property decides to sell it, that person has first dibs basically and right of first refusal. One of the things, you need to have a provision in there sort of setting up maybe brackets for what the sale price can be. Otherwise, that right of first refusal is useless. If it's a 2-acre property and the owner decides to sell it for $10 million, then there's no way that any tenant or anyone would probably be able to afford that payment. It would be sort of way out of their purchase range and what was out of what was intended by the right of first refusal. So you maybe want to set it at fair market value or a certain percentage above or below fair market value for the sale price when it comes time for right of first refusal. Another option for lease to own, and this sort of puts the decision in the tenant's hands, is option to purchase. And so when certain conditions are met, maybe when tenant has accumulated enough money for a down payment or any conditions that the two want to set up, tenant can exercise this option to purchase. And for that one too, you're going to want to create sort of a formula that basically sets what that purchase price might be. And if tenant's been on this property for a long time and has invested money in barns, has invested money in fencing, tenant's going to want to make sure that that's subtracted from the final sale price, just so tenant's not paying for those improvements twice. Same thing goes for a lease to own situation, and that's sort of the third situation that I'm describing. Lease to own is sometimes called a reverse mortgage because you're paying for your mortgage before title's actually transferred. And in lease to own, just one thing that I'll say is that it's usually not the entire lease price that goes towards the purchase price. It's usually just maybe half of it or a portion, just because tenant does owe landlord maybe a little bit for the lease, but it's almost like a piggy bank going towards the purchase of this property at a future date. The fourth type of land contract that I'm going to be talking about is partnership. I also sort of grouped investor in there, and one partnership is a legal entity. So when you enter a partnership, both parties share liability for that legal entity, for that farm. And so if you're entering a lease, and there's a lot of cooperation going on in this lease, but you don't want it to be a partnership, if landlord doesn't want to share the liability, you definitely want to put a clause in that lease saying that this document is creating a lease, it's not creating a partnership. We are not sort of legally bound in any sort of partnership situation. But if you do intend to create a partnership, it usually ends up being the landlord who is contributing most of the land, most of the money at the very beginning, or the infrastructure, and tenant who's contributing most of the labor. Now that situation can change, and tenant's responsibilities and capital investment can increase over time, and with that, their benefits can increase over time, and so the partnership can sort of shift in where those responsibilities are placed. And then the last one that I will bring up is creative or barter system. And we have a lot of folks on iFarm using this, and it's just basically as diverse as your operation and your intentions for that property. Two things I want to bring up about the creative or barter lease sort of options is that a lease always has to be for consideration. So there has to be something that the landlord is getting from the tenant. So if it is a lease that the tenant doesn't have to pay for, you want to put in the lease agreement that this lease is in consideration for maybe the tax deferral or maybe improvements to the property. So putting in there some sort of consideration that can be monetized that this lease is for, just to make it legal. And a lot of lease agreements will say this lease is for consideration of $1, the promises herein. But if you wanted to sort of lay that out in the benefits that are being exchanged to landlord as a result of this lease, that would be really beneficial in your contract. And then the second thing that I want to bring up about the creative or barter situation is that the services or goods, if you're doing barter, received are still taxable. So that's still income tax to the landlord and should technically be reported, although I think there are probably a lot of situations where it's not. So those are the 6 different types. And next I'm going to talk about 2 of the major terms, the major clauses in your lease that you're going to want to include. So one is payment schedule and the other is term, the duration of the lease. So with payment there are 3 different kinds. The first one is fixed cost, second that I'm going to talk about is variable cost, and the next one is prop share. Fixed cost is probably what a lot of folks do. It's pretty standard, especially maybe for a lot of vegetable leases, which I'm assuming will be happening here, or for livestock. And there are 2 different ways of setting that up. You can have either a flat fee for the entire property that the tenant has access to, or you can do a per acre. And I would recommend a flat fee, just because when you go per acre, the question arises, am I paying for the access routes? Am I paying for this non-arable land that I have to cross over to get to my farm? The boundaries become a lot more, it becomes contentious deciding exactly how much land is included in that acreage. So a flat fee is often done just to sort of alleviate those concerns up front. Then there's a variable lease, and this is what a lot of farmers will do, especially landlords will do with beginning farmers as tenants. So this, in a way, it sort of means that the landlord shares a bit of the risk because it's in landlord's interest that this property be as profitable as possible. So with a variable cost, tenant usually pays a percentage of their gross income. Landlord has to trust tenant to keep reliable books in this case. But one of the leases that I gave out, the sample lease from Malinowski Farms, I think it was a 10% rate for the lease with a floor of $600 and a ceiling of $1,600. Now, these are very high prices, but that's because it's very close to Portland and it's certified organic and has access to water. So a lot of considerations made that floor and ceiling. But in general, I would just recommend a floor and ceiling just so that landlord gets paid something at the bare minimum at least. And so that tenant, if tenant has an extraordinarily successful year, tenant isn't penalized for that. And then there's crop share. So crop share is similar to variable share, except for instead of getting a portion of the gross for that year, landlord gets a portion of the actual crop. And so that's usually done with commodities that might be done with wheat or something that has a market that both landlord and tenant can take the crop to and sort of get their own price and sort of negotiate in that way. Again, I want to say with crop share, that's a lot of times when landlord might get in trouble and be taxed as self-employed. So those are the three types of payment. With deciding the term or the duration of the lease, there are a lot of upfront sort of considerations. One is if you're growing more of a perennial crop, what is the life cycle of that perennial? So if raspberries, you might want to take them out after 8 years, you wouldn't want to sign a 12-year lease. That would put you in the middle of the crop cycle, and then if you have to leave, then you're going to have to at least decide how you're going to, how tenant's going to be reimbursed for the raspberries that are still up on the property or if they're pulled. It just creates a lot of hard considerations, whereas if tenant already knew that they were going to be pulling those plants after 8 years, then that lease could be for an 8-year term. A lot of times with beginning farmers, the lease will be for a short amount of time. That makes a lot of sense because the farmer might not have been sort of tested yet. They might not be absolutely certain that this is what they want to get into. And those short-term leases are good. It usually requires a little bit more work from the landlord. But one of the issues that you're going to want to discuss in that is whether there is an automatic extension without notice to terminate. So at the end of that lease, at the end of any lease, leases will always have the provision for how the lease ends, whether a party can terminate, whether the lease automatically renews. With a 1-year lease, it often gets forgotten, and with the long-term leases, it often gets forgotten. So you want to have a provision in there for perhaps automatic extension without notice to terminate, maybe in a 1-year lease, where 1 more year wouldn't be too difficult, and if the lease was really that bad, then one of the parties would have said, hey, we got to terminate this next year. So just having that automatic provision so that no one's violating the terms of the lease when it comes to renewal. And then you want to talk about indexing the lease if you do have that automatic renewal, because if you're paying $500 1 year, but due to inflation or due to maybe increased crop prices, you're able to pay more next year. I mean, you want to index that if you do want the amount for the lease to change over time, if you are doing that automatic extension. I will say too, with the short leases, you want to be careful if the tenant is interested in becoming certified organic, because that's a 3-year process. And if tenant just has a 1 or 2 year lease and they're already on the way towards certifying that property, they've invested a lot of time and effort into that and added value to that property. If in the event that that lease is not extended or does not is not renewed, then tenant loses all those that effort and that work on that property. So for any sort of certified organic lease, usually a longer term lease is recommended. And I will sort of give a general recommendation for vegetable leases. It's often 5 years. With a lot of vegetable growers, there's a lot of soil improvement that happens, a lot of addition of organic material, and so those vegetable growers tend to have a really strong attachment to that soil and to that wealth that they've built. So longer term leases are usually a little bit more preferable there, just to make it worth the farmer's while to add those amendments and to make that change to soil structure. For the longer term leases, 10 years and up, you're going to want to have some provisions in your lease for cumulative tenant breaches. And what I mean by that is, I mean, if tenant does something horrible like steal or set a tractor or set fire to a barn or something like that, you can terminate that lease. But if they're sort of long-term, sort of pervasive faults that are happening, like maybe constantly being 3 weeks late on payment of rent, or maybe just being not neat and tidy, or just having practices that don't quite meet the termination provisions of your lease, you want to have a provision in there for cumulative tenant breaches. And again, both parties really want to keep track of their performance throughout. So taking pictures of what you've done, if you've set this field fallow, marking when you've done that, if you've added amendments, marking when you've done that, but also if the other party fails to perform on their promises, marking that down so that it is possible to cancel the lease for cumulative tenant breaches. A couple things, and I don't have much time here, so I'm just going to mention a couple things really quickly. Usually insurance is required as part of the lease, and that's especially the case if they're on-farm activities, recreational activities, or agritourism. Usually, as far as taxes are concerned, usually landlord pays the property tax, but tenant pays for any personal property, so fixtures and things that could be removed. Afterwards, tenant usually pays that. Utilities are usually paid, sort of split up, but paid by the user. Whoever uses those utilities sort of pays that out. And usually landlord pays any assessments or special district taxes that sort of attach to the property. I did want to also say, I think the most important thing is the necessity of communication. So just being able to talk to each other and scheduling regular talks with each other so that you can sort out any minor problems before they become major. In the event that that doesn't work out, both parties can always agree to cancel the lease, and so long as they both agree together. If tenant is the only one who leaves the property, then tenant is still liable on that lease. So if it responsible for that lease. So if it's a 5-year lease, tenant's been there for 3 years, tenant's still responsible for paying rent for the remaining 2 years. The corollary of that is that landlord is responsible for finding another tenant and using due diligence to do that. But say the lease tenant was paying, like the original tenant was paying $500 for that lease, and landlord finds someone who is only able to pay $400 for that lease. Tenant is still on the hook for the missing $100 because tenant has an obligation to make sure that landlord receives $500 a month. And in the event that all this doesn't work out, I have some descriptions of alternative dispute resolution and binding arbitration. So alternative dispute resolution is when two parties get together and they have sort of a mediator help them sort things out. They can still go to court afterwards. But binding resolution or binding arbitration, both of the parties sort of agree from the very beginning that they're going to agree to whatever the neutral party thinks is best for them. And they do not have the right to sue afterwards if they don't like the outcome. So don't mean to end on that negative note, but we're going to have some people talking about some positive notes. So I'm going to ask Nancy to come up and share about her farm.
Just to put myself in context, my husband and I farm at Old Stage Road, north of Jacksonville, on the way toward Gold Hill. And we have 150 acres, and it's been in our family since 1902. And through a set of very sad circumstances, I inherited the property when I was 31. So now I'm going to tell you how old I am, because we've been leasing property for 40 years. So has come this next March. And so far it's going fairly well. We also farm the property ourselves, part of it. So I just looked at, this is just a list, my brainstorming list of things that I think about, and my husband and I think about when we're getting ready to do a lease. And when my dad died, he did have part of his property leased, so we inherited a lease. And as I was reviewing all this, we had that lease for the next 20 years. So it's some, these leases that you and relationships you develop with lessees and they with you can last a long, long time. So I think you need to think about when you are a landowner or a person who wants to lease land, need to think about what you need from the lease. And the person leasing the land needs to think, what does that landowner need? And when we first started with our farm, we were absentee landlords. We lived in Bend. My husband was already in the middle of his career, and we had 2 babies, and that was our stage of life. So we were absentee landlords for a long time until 1993 is when we first started doing hands-on ourselves at the farm. But what else does the farmer need? Maybe the farmer's too old to do it now. They don't have the equipment or the time, or maybe not the interest. Maybe the landowner has a piece of property that they want to maintain, but they don't have an interest in doing it. And then think about what you need from your lease. And some people are interested, their main goal is to maintain their water rights. For us, that's important. We're interested in the soil staying healthy. Some people are, their primary goal is to have it look attractive. They have a piece of property, they don't want to farm it themselves, they want it to look nice. My cousin Kay is in that situation. She wants to look out and see pretty green fields. Maybe they need to have help covering the cost of owning the property. It is expensive when you are paying for irrigation rights and taxes and insurance, and there are certain fixed costs that you can't get away from, and you need a way to cover that. Maybe some people need some contingency funds in addition to that to help with things that come up. The irrigation main line needs repair or something. And then the property owner, of course, would love to have some net gain from the farm too. That's one of the difficult things to achieve, I think. What are the goals for the property? What is this farmer or this landowner really looking for? And maybe it's a rural lifestyle, that's what they're after. In our case, we inherited this property. We saw it as a beautiful and a great resource, so we're interested in preserving it for the good of all and keeping it in agriculture. And we want to pass it along to the next generation. So we want to have leases and the care of the land, something that our children can take and continue doing that with, or they're not forced into some sort of decision about the land, that they can make decisions about the land that are right for them when they inherit it. Maybe soil health and productivity is the main goal for the property owner, or interesting projects to keep busy in retirement, and working with a lessee, not having the full responsibility, but working with a lessee that you're compatible with is really a lot of fun and very satisfying. Maybe somebody knows they're going to be selling the property, but they need to maintain it in a healthy state until they are ready to sell. For us, the process of negotiating a lease is to network within the farm community. Right now, we have somebody who leases our hay ground. We grow pears in our orchard, and we do that work ourselves. We lease our hay ground. We lease 3 acres to neighbors who are rose developers. So my front yard, it's in front of our house, so I have a front yard full of roses now these days. And we lease our, we have some land that's not, we have a lot of good class 1 soils, but we have a lot of soils that are the braided Greater Devonshire type and hilly and rocky. And so we have those leased to a young cattleman. And we've worked a lot with the people who do the hay in particular and the person who's doing the cattle. So we found 2 of them through OSU, taking a class at OSU, or having OSU know that we had a soil type and a situation that might be good for somebody to come in and use the land for what the purpose they're interested. Face-to-face meetings with the prospective lessee and to set goals and discuss needs, and just really getting acquainted with each other, walking the land, discussing the ideas and the options. The best leases are the leases that they have to be really well written, but the best part of a lease is the relationship the two parties have with each other, and that's going to do the most really in the long run of getting everybody what they want. And professionally written leases, that's a very important thing. I said we usually develop the lease, present it to the lessee, and then they tweak it and work with it, and then eventually we've got what we both want in the lease. Then what involvement does the landowner want to have or need to have in the actual project, other than providing the land? And the lessee, that's an important thing for both the lessee and the landowner to understand. Maybe the landowner has equipment that can be used, or can provide financial support. We've worked with the person who's leasing our pasture land and the NCRS, National Resource and Conservation Service, and the Soil and Water Conservation District to develop the irrigation and pasture land so that it is more productive, and we're using systems that will grow the good grass and water it properly, and be able to rotate the cattle through the pastures on a regular basis. So we've helped with financing in that way, or with if he needs fencing, we've provided the money for fencing, and he's provided the labor. So what kind of things can the landlord contribute? Maybe the landlord has skills, knowledge, and experience that can be valuable to the lessee. Community connections help connect the lessee with the organizations and the services that will be beneficial to them. Labor, with our hay ground, we share the irrigation. They water in the morning and we water in the evening. So there are things like that that you might work out. And then inputs. We often will pay for the inputs, the fertilizer, and the lessee will apply them. So those are some of the things that the landlord might contribute. And then landlord needs to know what they're going to need from the lessee, and of course it's skills and knowledge and the expertise to do the work, and their labor, maybe the equipment, and maybe everything's going to need to come from the lessee, and the landlord really is just going to provide pay the taxes and the water, and the lessee's going to do everything else. And marketing is another one that I put down, because we personally don't want to be involved in the marketing. Financial arrangements, and Nellie's gone over those. With our roses, we've established a flat fee for that property for I think it's a 5-year lease, and they pay annually a flat fee, and we base that on what our costs are, and then a little bit additional for us. On the hay ground, we've shared equally the costs and the income from the hay. On our pasture land, we've done that lease in stages because we were developing the land, so we've had a very low rent as we were getting all this work done, and it will increase over time as the lessee is able to put more cattle on the property. We're in the process of writing a very long-term lease that our children will probably inherit. So we're spending a lot of time on that lease to make sure that we've got all those I's dotted and T's crossed, because we want it to be something that they'll be able to pick up, and it'll be good in the future. So that we're doing in stages too, as far as we've set a mechanism so that the costs of owning the land go along with the lease as those increase or decrease, and a certain percentage of those costs will be charging an additional percentage on top of the cost, and that will increase as the crop comes into production and hits its peak. It's an orchard, so it's going to have a long life. So we're developing the lease that way. We are going to, in this case, it's going to be an absentee lessee. So we're going to, while we can, do some of the work for the lessee, because my husband has the expertise and skills needed for that, so we're going to help. So it's a complicated lease because it has a lot of different layers to it. Other lease considerations for me, and I've been writing like mad as Nellie talked, because now I have more, but we always have an annual meeting with our lessees. We may meet with them more often than that, and usually do, maybe every day when the people with the roses are out there working. But an annual meeting to review, even if the lease is, a long-term lease, to sit down and just take stock and see if there's anything we need to change or do differently. It's really important to us to protect the environment and the soil, and of course we're using a lawyer to help us develop this long-term lease, and I noticed that part of his kind of standard form this time is much longer than it had been in the past. So that's a great consideration, concern. A way out of the lease, and I think Nellie mentioned that. What happens if something, how are you going to get out of it if you need to? That's mainly for the tenant, I think. And then a process for handling non-payment and disputes. And we have had one lease, only one lease that we've had that became a situation where, and that was our 20-year lease, and I think that person, we were still absentee landlords, so we weren't there to help set the boundaries on a regular basis, and some things were getting out of bounds, and then the lease payments were getting more difficult for the lessee to make, and so we did finally have to terminate that lease and had to get some professional help to do that. So that can happen. That's the only time that's happened to us in 40 years, but we know that that can happen. My favorite leases at this time of our life, this will probably change as we get a little older, but have been to share the expenses and the income. It just, we happen to have, my husband happens to have the skills and the background and the knowledge to, you know, to be able to be a valuable participant with our lessees. And it usually is, we're providing some of the inputs, of course, working to do improvements and helping plan, you know, what's the next thing for this particular piece of ground. And it's just more interesting, and it helps avoid misunderstandings when you're both working at it. And I think the challenges have always been for us, it's expensive to own the land, and it's challenging to make a net profit for both the landlord and the lessee. And so that's always a goal for both sides. And we manage to hit that sometimes, and we manage to miss it sometimes. So.
And I've asked Maud if she can help me with this story, because Maud is our neighbor. We have, are any of you down in the little Applegate area or anywhere close to that geographically? So we're out on Yale Creek. Oh, you've been to Yale Creek Farm, yeah. So we bought this property in '88. It had, we were only the third owners of it since people started coming into that area. It's a beautiful piece of property. It has Yale Creek and the little Applegate River converge on the property. Lots of gorgeous pasture land. We felt like we had found a piece of history in this land, and we decided what we wanted to do was to, I'll back up. Any of you know Wendellberry? Wendellberry is part of our community, our larger community, not our community here. And so we had been well indoctrinated by Wendellberry, who is kind of the father of sustainable agriculture from a long time back. So we decided we wanted to do sustainable agriculture and promote that. Ask us how much we knew about agriculture. Poems. Vast numbers of poems and essays. But we knew we could figure it out. So we moved into the double wide that Clara and Sandy had been living in. Clara and Sandy had been farming this for probably 50 years. We spent the first 10 years cleaning it up. They had been chemical cattle people. That's what they did. They did cattle on it, but they managed all of their hay, all of everything else chemically. And I can't tell you how many truckloads of baling twine we found, and casings for engines. You know, clean something out and there's an oak casing for an engine. It was your old farming. I mean, it was the two of them, and they had 250 acres. We came in with a friend. She put in part of the money. We turned around, gave her part of the land, turned around and used that for the down payment on the land. And then their son, who was a banker, financed it. Richard and I came out of being school teachers and school counselors. We had no savings. So it just fell like this. We met Tim Franklin. When did we meet him? Maud, do you remember?
98.
98. So probably met him in the earlier 90s because he would come out. He was working with the Applegate watershed. Any of you know Tim? Had dealings with him? Just one of the all-time wonderful, wonderful supporters of sustainable agriculture and educator of young farmers in Southern Oregon, just magnificent. And so if you know him, you know that last October he was killed in a very tragic accident. Came around a corner and there was someone coming toward him in his lane. So, huge loss to the whole valley and to all of sustainable agriculture. So Richard and I are in shock, and we never had a lease with Tim.
Right, so to back up, so since 98, Tim has been basically managing
Yes,
the farm
he
and
has.
running his own business, which you all were financing. But
We were.
it was handshake agreements more than anything, not much written down. But really what was being held by all of them was this vision of sustainable agriculture, a teaching farm, a model. So there's a lot of strong feelings and vision involved, but less of the kind of nuts and bolts that Nellie and Nancy have
Yes.
said.
I would say our net profit for the whole time we've had the farm has been minus approximately $40,000 to $50,000 a year. We have never broken even. But what we've broken even in is the number of young farmers we have educated and the amount of sustainable agriculture education that's gone on out at the farm. So now our whole thing is called to a screeching halt. We don't know what to do.
Yeah.
Richard and I are pretty full-time consultants to environmental and conservation organizations around the country. So we're gone a lot. And Tim has it. Maud probably knows more of the ins and outs of the farm than we do at this point. So we've spent the last year digging into that, going through all of Tim's files. We have no written leases, and we have to figure out what to do. Tim has a young man he had been mentoring since he was a freshman in high school. And he's now finishing up his degree in business at SOU and running a cattle business. So we said, Daniel, would you like to just do your cattle business on the farm? And because you've been trained by Tim, you know exactly what to do. And he said, yes, of course. And I can't teach people. I can't help them learn about it. That's not my thing, and it's not any, I'm not talented that way, so I can't pick that part of it up. He said, well, we'll do an interim thing. So we don't charge him anything, so there's no point for a lease. We have a piece of paper that says, you will not use chemicals, you will use all of Tim's practices that you put into place. You can use all of the farm equipment. If any of it breaks, you're responsible for fixing it. And we expect you to keep the grounds free of debris. So,
especially baling twine.
Yeah, especially baling twine. And anytime you have anyone come on the property to do irrigation ditches, I don't care what they're doing. Here is a hold harmless agreement. They must sign it. Richard and I will not be legally liable for you bringing someone on, using our equipment, and then getting hurt. So if you're not willing to do that, and they're not willing to sign it, then they can't come on the property. Now, of course, that doesn't include Mom. She does not come on the property to work. But if you have, I'm going to say leases for the purpose of this talk, if you have leases coming on the property to work and they're bringing other people on the property to work, you know, we think it's very, very important to have some kind of insurance backup so that you're not carrying that because they're not working with you. And then 2 young men who have been working as interns in the Little Applegate for a number of years, and everyone knew them, and we knew them, came and said, Wisconsin isn't working out so well for us. We want to come back to the Little Applegate. So they're living on the property in our studio, and they're doing all of the farm vegetables and micro vegetables, and one of them's a cheese maker. With all of the people who are on our farm, we don't charge them a fee to be there. There's no rental. But there are very strictly held provisions about sustainable agriculture that they have to know and be able to show us that they know before we're willing for them to be there. Now, the 2 that are managing the place now are also, I think, this next year, because they needed to get settled first, going to be able to start up educating people again. Taking young farmers, people who think they want to farm, help them understand how you do it, and move them along. We don't even have a written thing with them. We just have understanding. We try to be out there once a week, checking in with them, walking around the property, see what's going on. It's a very, Nellie, I'm sure sitting over there going, oh my gosh, it's a legal nightmare. But we did not buy the property in order to make a living from it. We bought the property in order to practice a particular agricultural philosophy and to help young farmers learn how to farm sustainably.
That you were addressing, Linda, about liability and having insurance and stuff for when other people come on. Another clause that's really common and important in a lease is an indemnification clause. So basically it says that if landlord has to pay for any of anything that tenant's done, so maybe illegal dumping or something that landlord has to pay to clean up, the tenant will reimburse landlord for those payments. So that's one thing, again, on the scary side.
I will get your card before I go.
So do people have questions for any of our panelists?
Specifically your situation out at Yale Creek, without having any sort of, written binding agreements, what potential nightmare do you have if you were to attempt to evict these people? I know when you have a contract, if there's a breach of contract, that can be done, but are you almost setting up a situation where there's squatters and you're going, I mean, I know that I know the people involved and I'm not worried about it.
Yes.
But in that similar situation, how do you just protect yourself by knowing the people and interviewing them and feeling comfortable with it?
Absolutely. And getting personal references from people who've worked with them. And, it's I don't mean this the way they use it in the media. It's a faith-based relationship, meaning I have faith in them. Daniel, I know his whole family. We've known him since he was a freshman in high school. So he knows that if he does something onerous, we're just going to kick his little butt off. And he knows that. But it would never be illegal.
Other questions? Yeah?
Nancy, you were saying that you found your lessor or lessee in a class at SOU. What class was it?
At OSU.
OSU, okay.
We took a class on how to, what was designed for farmers who have employees, and he was in that situation with his day job, and so we got acquainted, and I had mentioned we were looking for someone for our pasture, and he mentioned that, and he connected.
So it's like a farm financial class.
It was labor management.
Labor management.
Yeah, yeah. It was kind of random, the topic. We haven't actually done, this is the first time we've been involved in this kind of land lease connection.
But the other connection, the person who's wanting to do an orchard on our place had contacted the extension agency, and I'm sure they gave him several ideas of people to contact, but we were one of them. So I didn't see if you were a landowner or a prospective lessee, but like those. Oh, okay. And I'm yellow, so okay. Anyway, that's that OSU is a really good resource. You probably already know that, and the Soil and Water Conservation District is another really good resource. Friends of Family Farmers has a resource, and Ryan is a good resource too. Any questions? Yeah.
For Nellie, if a landowner has already transferred the deed over to somebody else and has maintained a lifetime estate in the property, can they enter into, say, a 10-year, say they're 90 years old, can they enter into a 10-year contract that would continue on after they pass away?
That's a really good question. I mean, it depends on, usually the life estate will sort of lay out who can make decisions that last beyond the term of that life tenancy. So that should be, I would look at the details of that agreement. I think to cover your bases, I would absolutely have both the current life tenant and the successors to the property sign the lease and agree to its terms, just to avoid any potential conflict. I would be really leery of that. But, yeah.
Then on another situation, a landowner, the property is held under 2 LLCs, and I think it's a trustee is the local attorney.
Mm-hmm.
The LLC, look it up on the Oregon website or whatever, it gives the actual landowner as the one, I don't know if it's a board or whatever, that has the LLC. When you enter into an agreement, does it have to go through the attorney, or can the actual landowner who has the LLCs enter into the contract?
Depends on, is that landowner the only member of the LLC, or are there other?
The only one listed under the Secretary of State or whatever that is.
if it's owned by two LLCs, I mean, that's a more complex situation if the attorney
Same
is
guy on
represent.
both LLCs.
Same guy on both LLCs. I would assume that that person could sign on behalf as a member. I mean, this is not legal advice, but it would be my assumption that that person could make that decision that the attorney is simply representing or the agent for that LLC. So I want to talk to the person who is the actual member of those LLCs and have them sign it.
Yeah, for Nellie, our property is, the actual owner is an LLC. And one thing we've thought about doing would be to create a home site in the non-agricultural area. Could the LLC do a ground lease to a third party that would want to build a home there? Or maybe a vegetable processing kitchen or something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if depending on how the voting structure is set up and how many members are members of that LLC, if the LLC could absolutely agree to make that lease.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, Linda, you're saying something that you found someone to come up with a down payment or a certain amount of money, and you gave them access to the land, or did it become like co-housing?
Because we have a logging road that goes through the original 1800s property, we were allowed, it's in 2 tax lots.
Okay.
So we sold her the tax lot across the road, and she gave us the money for it that we could use for, I mean, it's just like one of those things that falls into your lap, you just do it, right? Yeah.
A question for the panel, particularly maybe Nancy. Conservation leases or leases for riparian value, things like that. Any thoughts or experience on how those may also fit in with agricultural leases? Thinking, I don't know if you have any conservation easements on your leased property or anything, but just thoughts about how those might work together.
We don't have any conservation easements on our property, and I really don't know how that would work.